All right, welcome back to class. This is the lesson 4 of the third module under the product owner training. In the previous lessons, we looked at who the product owner is. We looked at what the product owner does in a sprint. And in the third lesson, we looked at the product vision, what the elements of a vision statement and the rest. So in this class we would be looking at, just a moment, we'll be looking at the artifacts in Scrum. Of course, let's cast our mind back quickly to module 1 and module 2, where we looked at the 353 of Scrum, talking about the first three. Those are the product owner role, the scrum master role, and the developer role. Then the 5 artifacts talking about the sprint planning, the daily scrum, the sprint review, and the sprint retrospective. And the last 3, or the second 3 of the 353, talking about the 3 artifacts, the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the product increments. Of course, we have good knowledge of what these are, but from this angle, we want to look at it as a product owner. We've mentioned in previous classes that the product owner owns the product backlog. Requirements from the stakeholders are created or translated into specifications in the product backlog. When we get to the practicals in full, you would be having stakeholders giving you specific requirements. So as a product owner, you are now to take those requirements and convert them into specifications that will be stacked up in your product backlog. And that is what this product backlog training is all about. So we'll be looking at what the product backlog is. In subsequent classes, we would um, look at all the elements in all these. So, sorry, I'm a bit distracted. I'm just trying to catch up with a response from someone. All right, sorry about that. So, all these are what we would be going through. So at the end of the whole journey of the product owner, you would know what the product backlog is. You'll be able to visualize it. At the practicals, you'll be able to create your own product backlog. At the practicals, you'll be able to engage with the stakeholders, take briefs from these product stakeholders, and convert them into product backlog. So this journey in this class is to give you the knowledge of what the product backlog is, what are the elements of the product backlog, how do you create the product backlog, and things like that. So let's jump right into it. The product backlog from the angle of the product owner. You know, the Scrum Master looks at the product backlog differently from how the product owner looks at the product backlog. So in this lesson, you are looking at it as a product owner that owns the product backlog. Right, so that sets the foundation for this class. Here we go. So we'll take a quick look at what we have on this left side first. Then from there we'll relate further. So this is the products backlog. We can see this stacked up here being the product backlog item. So in the product backlog PB, we have the PBI. We have the PBIs. In the product backlog, we have the product backlog items. That is why we've often made reference to work items, making reference to the item in the product backlog, right? So what you have in your PB, product backlog, you have your product backlog items. Items are each of those tasks that need to be worked on. That's what the product backlog item is. We could see from here, this, or rather this, represents a requirement from the stakeholder. A stakeholder comes around to say, I want, let's look at the building project that we've been illustrated from. Again, why we've always been using the building projects, I believe, is what everybody could relate well with. Of course, we all at one point or the other, we've seen, we've built, we've supervised, we've managed, we've lived in buildings. So that is what we could relate well with. Okay, so let's say the stakeholder comes around to say, I want a particular type of roofing structure, and he goes around to describe what the roofing structure he wants is. I want this corrugated aluminum sheets, the long span, whatever the stakeholder describes. I want the roofing logging, those are the formwork, to be 20 feet high, whatever description the stakeholder describes. So it is now left for the product owner to convert the requirements of the stakeholder into specifications. What do we need to deliver on? To now break them down. And we can see from here, this is still the PBI. Everything here is the PBI. The items inside are the I, right? This is the product backlog itself, and it has product backlog items inside. And in the product backlog, you could have some as features. You could have some as defects. Defects are errors that need to be corrected, right? Then you could have some as technical work. So the technical work are specifications, detailing of the technicality, the measurements. For instance, well, as we go further, you would see when we get to user story, how we create user story as a product owner. So the technical work makes reference to the detailing of what needs to be carried out, the specification, the specification to units that makes it clear for the developers to know clearly what he or she needs to do. That's the technical work. Then, of course, we also, as needed, could have the knowledge acquisition. The knowledge acquisition is building capacity to deliver that work. I'd explained that in module 2, but let me expand on what this means. Let's say, for instance, um, we have a cross-functional team, and a member of the cross-functional team knows how to use a saw as a carpenter, SAW, to to cut wood, to saw off wood, right? So a carpenter knows how to do that properly. So that becomes his capacity. But in the product cycle of what we are to develop, it requires us to use a bigger machinery. It requires that we have lots of logs or wood loggings to prepare for the roofing structure. We have lots of wood to cut, and it will take a lot of time for us to use the saw, the manual saw, to cut those woods. So according to the product design, in sprint 4 we would be cutting those timber logs into sizes, and we need to use a chainsaw instead of the manual saw. We now need to use an automated saw, the chainsaw. But no member of the team has that capacity to use the chainsaw. What they could use is the manual saw. But of course, as a carpenter with good knowledge of using the manual saw, they could build on that capacity to use chainsaw. So what do you do as a product owner? You will now create stories, work items, but this work item in this case is for knowledge acquisition. That particular developer, that is a carpenter, that knows how to use the manual saw, you would now bring in training for the carpenter in, for instance, sprint 2. So by the time in sprint 2 the carpenter would have completed learning how to use chainsaw, possibly in sprint 3 would have, if you create another story for that, would have mastered how to use chainsaw. When you now get to sprint 4, is now demonstrating that value that had been learned. So you could find stories in your product backlog focusing on knowledge acquisition, trainings, lessons that would be needed, that would be used as you go further in the course of delivery. So you could have all this in your product backlog. And features alone is now explained further into all this. We'll be seeing all this as we go on. The user story format is just a style of writing feature. The use cases format, then the free form test. So all these things would end up in your product backlog, and they would form what we call the product backlog item. So the product backlog is a dynamic and ordered list of all the work that needs to be done to develop and improve a product. All an ordered list of all the work that needs to be done. These are lists of work we have the list of all the work that needs to be done, all the work that needs to be done here in an ordered way to develop or improve a product, to accomplish a product goal. That is what it's saying. So a product goal could be building an entirely new product. A product goal could also be improving a product. A product's goal could be just anything, right? So a product backlog is a dynamic because it should be adaptive, something that could change based on the stakeholders' requirements, right? Something that is flexible, that is dynamic, that is not static, that is improving. You could come back again to reorder your stories based on need. You could create more stories. You could take out old stories, something living. Let me use that word loosely. So the product backlog should be a living product backlog, meaning something that is not rigid, that could have in and out of work items, adaptive work items, and so on and so forth. So it serves as the single source of truth, SST. The product backlog serves as the single source of truth for the Scrum team to understand what needs to be accomplished to achieve the product vision, goal, and objectives. Right? When we say it serves as the single source of truth, what that means is that mere looking at the product backlog, whosoever that is looking at the product backlog, be it the stakeholders, be it members of the development team, be it members of the Scrum team, at a quick glance, they understand clearly what they need to do. They understand clearly what the product journey is. They understand clearly what the product vision is. So the product backlog should contain every piece that would make up the story. Let me illustrate that again from this angle. You know, children play with puzzles. You know, those tiny, small cutouts, tiles like stuff to make up images, right? So imagine that the product backlog should contain all the pieces that would make up a full image. Nothing should be missing. So that is what the product backlog should be. It should have all the stories, all the work that needs to be done. Now it becomes a living product backlog because you can add more, you can take some out, you can adjust them. They are flexible. When something is changing, you are adapting to those changes also, right? So, but at a quick glance, everybody should know this is where the product is heading. A good product backlog should achieve that. So it serves as a single source of truth for the Scrum team to understand what needs to be accomplished to achieve the product's vision, goals, and objective. We'll break this further down when we get to the practicals. When you need to create your own stories yourself, your own product backlog, right? At the start of your sprint, on the first sprint, all the members of the team would need to come together and populate the first product backlog. Then from there, each product owner would need to manage the product backlog and be responsible for all the stories in the product backlog. There would still be some knowledge acquisition that we've developed into your practicals. So it would be the responsibility of the product owner to create stories for those knowledge acquisitions also in your sprints, right? So ideally, each item has value to the user of the product. And in the next slide, we would see what it is like. I've shown this earlier. We can see that each item has value. It has a well-defined value to the user of the product. From this illustration, this lady represents the product owner, and we can see different items in her hands, and we can see different stakeholders extending requirements over to the product owner, right? I had mentioned in module 2 that every work item should come from the stakeholders to the product owner. It shouldn't go directly to the developers, but it should come through the product owner, so that the product owner stack so that the product owner would now stack all of these on the product backlog. The product owner takes each of the item, stacks it up on the product backlog, and every product backlog is pointing also to the product goal. So that is the illustration from here. Let's move further. Yes. So we could see from here, from the vision that we spoke about in the last class, product vision, to the product backlog. The customer or the end user, this represents the end user. You can see two layers of stakeholders here. The customer is also a stakeholder, by the way, but is as an end user stakeholder. This stakeholder here represents business stakeholder, the organization you work for. This customer stakeholder here could represent either the end user that will consume that product, or a client to the organization you work for. Where it is a client to the organization you work for, we call this B2B. B2B, which means business to business. When the stakeholder, the external stakeholder, is another business that you're working for. Take for instance, you work in an organization and it is an IT organization, and one of the things we do in the organization is that we develop websites. Now, you are not the one consuming the website, you are just the one developing the website. Here is a business that has a fashion store, right? This is another business that owns a fashion store and has chains of stores all across the region. Now, at some point, this business needs a website, approaches your own business, build us a website. You know, the website to be built for this fashion store, they are not the ones consuming it directly. They have their own customers all across the region that will be consuming the product, but they own it. So this becomes a business to business, where the organization you work for is developing a product directly for the customer. That is called B2C, business to customer, right? So it could come in different forms. So we could have a customer, outsider, external stakeholder, as either a business or another or a customer, a proper customer, an end user customer, or a client customer, right? Let's differentiate by those. End user customers, those are the customers to consume it, or client customers. I often make reference to them as end user stakeholders or client stakeholders because they are all stakeholders. Even an internal management team is a stakeholder to the development team, right? So let's assume a client customer has a vision, just as I've mentioned. You want to build a website for your product. You have stores, you have stores building, you have stores selling um, clothing materials. So you want to build a website for that. That is your big idea. That big idea needs to be converted to a strategy. How do you achieve that strategy? You meet with the stakeholder, another business, guys, build us a website, and you give them the requirements needed. They now take those requirements and break them down into different layers. They set out the strategies. In Agile, this strategy would be done between business to business, in this case, between the internal, pardon me, between the internal and the external. It will be done business to business, right? And what happens in Agile is that members of the business would be meeting with the externals to come up with a strategy in a collaborative way. There could be brainstorming sessions and all the rest. Sometimes the product owner would be dragged along these meetings with the customers so that the product owner is also there having the first hand information that the external stakeholder wants, and they come up with a strategy for it. In that illustration, we're talking about building a website for e-commerce. So we now need to look at, okay, what will be the back end? What will be the database for the website? What will be the access point to the database? How would customers be able to access securely? In that access would be, how would they would be all the details, their payments information, their personal information and the rest, and also what infrastructure are we using for the entire thing. So they come up with a strategy in a collaborative way. So we can see that it is the same big idea here that is now broken into the strategies. But the strategies, the team now takes it in, management team takes that in and sits further to brainstorm and begin to break them down into pieces of layers. And they come up with tactics for the strategies. How do we achieve a secured login journey? How do we achieve a database that is secured and robust, that is accessible, that is that could scale? Scaling means it could expand when needed. When there are more traffic, it automatically increases the bandwidth. You know, um, things like that. When it goes to other region, it has replications that makes it more accessible, also making it available. So the team will now break it down to further pieces. By the time it gets to the team, it would have been broken further into tiny pieces. And this is what Agile does. So Agile, or Scrum in this case, breaks the entire big project into small chunks, smaller chunks, smallest chunks. And each of these could be broken into tasks. And based on the team's capacity, the task could be taken into the product backlog. So that is how it works. So for instance, if this team has capacity to work on, let's assume each of these piece rather is 2 points. So we have 2 points, meaning the team has capacity, a team of 3 developers. Mind you, Scrum team is between 5 to 9, so you could actually have 3 developers plus the product owner and the Scrum master. So let's say a team of 3 developers, they have capacity to work on let's say 12 stories per 2-week sprint. 12 stories per 2-week sprint. That means each person could work on 4 stories per sprint, right? Meaning each person could work on 2 story, 2 stories, 2 story points rather. Pardon me, I make reference to story points, not numbers of stories, but the story points. 2 story points per week of a 2-weekly sprint. I hope that is clear. So each person, let's assume each person could work on 4 story points per sprint. Then it means that the product owner would bring in total work item that would equate to 12 story points. So if each of these is a 2 story point, so the product owner is bringing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We have 7 here. So 6 of these would be translated into your product backlog, right? Mind you, this last to be action would form the product backlog. So everything here would move into your product backlog. And based on the team's availability and capacity, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? This will now go into your sprint backlog. So that's how it works. So we could see the product owner taking all the requirements from the stakeholders and translating them into a product backlog. While work is on, is still meeting with the stakeholders again and again and looking at the changes. The customer could come back and say, please, could we have the logo of the organization on the right side of the website? Oh, that's beautiful. No problem, we'll do that. And while in development, while they're still developing that, the customer sees a need to come back and say, never mind, let's have the logo on the left side this time around. Okay, if it's something we could accommodate, fine. So we have the requirements that could be slightly changing. Let me be clear on this. In Scrum, you do not need to worry much on the costs. Scrum focuses on developing a product that meets exactly what the stakeholder wants. When we go further, we will see how the product owner has an idea or makes estimates for the project, looking at budgets, but the objective of Scrum clearly is delivering value to the customer, right? So all these will now be translated into your product backlog. Next slide. And in the next slide, I believe we are conversant with this now, which is the criteria for having a healthy product backlog. A product owner should keep a healthy product backlog, maintaining a healthy product backlog. And what is expected is that each piece of the story should be detailed appropriately. All the needed information should be added to the story. So when you are creating your own story for your sprint, when you get to the practicals, we will be looking out for the full details of that story. And what that means is that any developer that picks that story, when I mean story, it also means user story, and it also means work items, work item, or it also means task. So every user, every developer rather, every developer that is to work on that story should open that story and sees clearly what he or she needs to do. The developer needs not call on the product owner. Product owner, what do I need to do here? I need more specification. All the specifications should be added to that story. Every information should be added to that particular story. So when you roll over to the practicals, we'll be looking out at your stories. Each one of them, they should be detailed enough. Then the E is estimation. We want to have an idea how long it will take to complete that task. So at this point, at the product owner level, it could have some understanding of how long that task should take. However, when this team sits on the backlog at the sprint planning meeting, the team now goes into some form of voting where each person could express themselves on how long they feel each task should take. So in practicals, again, we'll be making use of Planning Poker as a tool where you'll be able to make use of to coordinate the team on how long each work item should take. Right? So that is what the estimate is. And I've often made reference saying the estimate is different from the actual. The estimate is just an idea. How long should it take? The roofing structure we are trying to build, how long will it take us to put up the formwork for the roof? Then how long will it take us to begin to put the roofing sheets? How long will it take us to paint those things in that order, on and on and on? So there should be an estimate. Then again, the emergent, we've explained this again and again, where each work item is flexible. You could bring changes to it as needed. When the product owner, the stakeholder, was meant to say, when the stakeholder came back and said, oh, could you move the logo to the left side? Your backlog is flexible to accommodate such. So you should be able to move things around on your detailing. This emergency is talking about the detail. It should be flexible to accommodate. It should be dynamic enough. Then the last one, which stands for P, we're talking about the deep criteria, DEEP. The last one, which stands for prioritization, is the order in which features would be developed. So the product owner should have a clear understanding that, guys, we need to lay the formwork for the roofing structure before we begin to fix the roofing sheets on the formwork. I hope this is clear to us. Simple rule: keep it updated, ready for at least 2 sprints ahead. When we say ready for at least 2 sprints ahead, we should have an idea that we're making reference to backlog refinements. When your backlog is continuously being prepared and made ready for future sprints. All right, so that will be all the class for this lesson. We'll meet again in the next lesson, but briefly, we have been able to look at the first artifact in Scrum from the angle of the product owner, breaking it down to what the product backlog could contain, then also how stakeholders' requirements get translated to the specifications built by the product owner that would now end up in the product backlog. If you have any question at any point, please note them down and send them across. I'll be glad to jump over and also do justice to those. We'll see you again in the next class. Bye for now.